I just want to thank everybody for joining us here today for this brief webinar on a very important subject of financial integrity, especially within the nonprofit sector. My name is Austin Dressman, and I'm the Community and Events Manager here at Engaging Networks. I've been here about just over 2 years, and love getting to know so many of the organizations, some of the people that are using our platform, using Engaging Networks every day for some really great causes. I'm based in New Mexico, mountains just east of Albuquerque, and love it out here. One of my favorite things on webinars, though, is it's one of those cliche things, but it's just getting everyone to say in the chat like where they are, where they're tuning in from. I always just love seeing that. So feel free if you want to do that. But because this is a webinar on fraud, please keep it high level. Gotta be smart. Don't give your exact address or anything. Um, we're very excited to hear from Christy Watkins, who is the Senior Product Manager of Merchant Fraud Solutions at WorldPay. Christy is also a certified payments and fraud prevention professional, which is one of the cooler professional titles I've ever heard. And it should also let you know you're hearing all of these fraud prevention and financial integrity tips and trends from someone that really knows what they're talking about. So you're in the right place if that's what you want to hear about. So Christy, I will pass the baton off to you. And as a reminder to everyone here, we encourage you to drop any questions you have in the comments. We will do our best to address them as Christy's going over. Specifically, if you're asking a question about something she's going over at the moment, we'll try to pause on that. But otherwise, we will hold them until a Q&A section at the end. But without further ado, Christy.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited to talk to the group today about fraud trends, and probably not fraud itself, but protecting your payments, being aware of different fraud trends that are emerging, how to protect yourselves and stay on top of the different trends in e-commerce as a whole. As mentioned, I'm Christy Watkins. I'm the Senior Product Manager in our merchant fraud team within WorldPay. I've been with the company for almost 7 years now in a couple of different roles. Actually was part of the go-to-market team that helped launch our flagship fraud solution. And fun fact about me, I actually have a connection to nonprofit. Back in 2009, I worked in minor league baseball, and I was our nonprofit sales specialist. So I worked with a lot of great organizations, and I understand, all of the work that you do in the nonprofit space, how important it is, and, how now being able to work with you all to help share about how to protect yourselves, your donors, and really keep your business going and keep the funds coming in. So I'm going to kind of talk through 3 different pieces of the kind of payments ecosystem and how fraud really happens. So first, I'm just going to quickly start with some e-commerce trends, what we're starting to see in the payment space, how it's impacting the nonprofit space. And then I'll dig a bit more into the specific fraud trends that we're seeing, especially ones that we're noticeably seeing in the nonprofit space and where you guys seem to be getting hit the most. And then I'll really close it out with different prevention techniques and best practices that you can leverage to help protect your data, your payments, and give you a little bit of insight into what you can do with that. So to kick that off, what we're seeing from an e-commerce space is the global e-commerce market grew 19% to over 4.6 trillion last year. And this was based on 2020, 2021 data. That was the highest growth in the past 5 years. And it equated to almost 3 years of a typical acceleration in a single year. And what we're really seeing, or what's driving a lot of that e-commerce growth, the pandemic was a big one. When you think about everybody having to stay home, all of a sudden organizations really needed to think about, how do I keep my business going? And that was shifting to online. When I think about kind of your space in the nonprofit, having donors, being able to not get people together, not have in-person events. So how can you continue to maintain your business? So we saw a lot of people move online, and it happened very, very quickly. And since the pandemic, donors, we've noticed just specifically in nonprofit, expect the convenience of online donation now. So a lot of nonprofits are looking to capture more donations and want to make giving easy. So diversifying the different ways that people can pay, can give, is really important. And it also allows you to not just give your existing donors and existing partners ways to pay, ways to provide you with gifts. It also allows you to expand your reach. So if you are more of a local or regional driven organization, by going online, by giving people diversification in their ability to give, really allows you to keep that reach open and expand. I think of myself, for example, I am someone who moved 9 times in the past 10 years. So I lived in Florida, I lived in Nevada, I lived in Ohio, now I'm in the Northeast. And so for me, there's a lot of organizations that I've been able to kind of work with and be a part of. And the ability now for me to, even though I'm not as locally located, be able to still give to those organizations. So being able to go online, offering different payment methods such as digital wallets. So as much as you talk about being able to just capture debit and credit cards, digital wallets is a huge growth area as well. So people being able to pay with Apple Pay, Google Pay, Cash App, those are all trends that we're really starting to see and that are impacting the nonprofit space. Additional trends that we're seeing is 55% of millennial and Gen X and 54% of baby boomers donors prefer to give online via credit or debit card. So we're not just seeing that growth in the younger generations with the millennial and Gen X, we're actually seeing the baby boomers right up there in the same percentages as wanting to be able to just go online, leverage a debit or credit card, and leverage that convenience and efficiency of the online payments. It continues to grow in popularity, especially as e-commerce grows. That trend is making it into the other verticals, which is why it kind of brings us here today, which is understanding and learning more about how we can safeguard that payment process, create that environment where, you know, supporters can donate, but not have the fear of data being stolen, captured, or, you know, potential card information, any of their information being taken advantage of by scammers who unfortunately are out there. And we'll dig into how they are getting data and what that looks like. So to quickly kind of wrap it up from an e-commerce trend, from a nonprofit, the e-commerce sites and online donation solutions are playing a larger role in the gifting process. So being able to do donations quick, easy, and keeping them secure, which is what we'll go into. Kind of high level, when we think about e-commerce, cash usage is in a decline globally. This is just from the broader spectrum of all e-commerce and all payments. And then this is an important one that I added, which is e-commerce payment innovation is constant and moving faster than ever. And I always think this is important because we see things like ChatGPT, we see things like digital wallets, we see so much innovation, machine learning, AI, right? That's all really key words that we're hearing that sound really fun and exciting in the technology space, in the payment space where I work. But it goes both ways. And that's actually where it's going to lend us to e-commerce fraud. And I like to say, you know, as much as the good people are out there building great technology that's making all of our lives easier and our businesses more successful, there are just as smart and savvy and innovative fraudsters and scammers that are out there leveraging the same technologies available to attack and to find ways to steal credit card information, steal data, and use it in, you know, the fraudulent ways. So just to take a quick step back, I'm going to kind of say, what is online payment fraud? So payment fraud, it's a broad term, and it ultimately means, you know, payments are being used illegally by cyber criminals on the internet. It's usually stolen credit cards, information to make unauthorized transactions, take sensitive data, money, other forms of property from people that they're stealing that information from. While most members of the public seem to be wary of the risks of payment fraud, I think we all know that fraud is a potential risk. We all potentially get those texts from our banks, or as an organization, potentially you see customers or donors get declined. The nonprofit sector is actually going to be much higher. It's impacted at a higher rate than other types of businesses. Some of the reason that we see that, and I'll get into more detail around it, is just the fact that, fraudsters tend to find where they can get in the most. So when you might be, a more mid-sized organization or a smaller organization, they will figure that out and say, okay, they're less likely to have really robust fraud prevention. And so what they'll do is they'll go out there, they'll try, one or two types of fraud transactions that you won't even notice. And then when they see that they can get through, that's when they start to really scale their fraud. And over 92% of donors say it is very important to them that their information is protected. So how do we kind of combat and understand that resources are always a constraint, but we need to protect our information, and fraudsters are out there attacking? It's like the trifecta of just how do we make this work? So before I go into even additional kind of digging into what the fraud is, I am just going to quickly pause to see, Austin, has there been any questions that have come up so far that I can help answer before we go further?
Not yet, but I am going to launch that poll because this is a perfect.
Oh yeah, sorry.
No, this is perfect because you just asked, you just defined exactly what, what we're talking about. And the poll, I'm just going to throw it out here. It should just show up on your screen just now. Have you experienced this at all so far up to this point this year? And I'll let you, Chrissy, kind of keep going. Otherwise, we don't have any questions as of yet, but we can launch the results of the poll as you're speaking to this.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, let me know when the results come in. We'll keep going. So from a fraud perspective, we talked about e-commerce growth. We saw the numbers there. Successful fraud attempts have increased by 52% in 2021. So that is scaling at the same rate. I think this is exceeding actually the rate of e-commerce growth. And nonprofits specifically are at that increased risk for fraud, as I mentioned. So while over 69% of nonprofits think fraud is a significant risk to the sector, almost 50% do not have best practice protections, such as anti-fraud tools or firewalls to kind of stop that fraud. And that's kind of goes back to the point of where fraudsters recognize this. They know about that 50% not having protections. They test it out, they try it, and they will do kind of waves within a vertical. So they'll look at like just nonprofit as a whole, and they'll say, okay, well, we know that that's an underprotected type of business. So we're going to go after that sector, and we're going to find different ways to do it.
And Christy, I'll go ahead and just launch those results. You'll see it's pretty clear. Everyone has been affected, at least in some way, likely in recent years here. But just this year alone, almost 70%. So
yeah, absolutely. So this is actually, I think, gonna hopefully be helpful for you all. Unfortunately, I wish that wasn't the number, right? I think we all wish that wasn't the case. But I do want to share the different types of fraud that some of you may have felt in that 69%. The first thing I'm going to dig into is the dark web. And that's really going to give a bit more insight into how the dark web works, what that means. I think we all probably have a vision in our mind of what the dark web is and how it impacts us. But it's actually so much bigger than what you would even think. I was actually surprised as doing some research around the dark web, just how robust it is. Bots and card testing attacks, I will say from my experience, just working in merchant fraud in the nonprofit sector, that's what I see the most. That's where I see the biggest impact, is those, high velocity card testing attacks, where fraudsters are just running a script and really trying to test cards. Account takeover, that is a big one too, where fraudsters are out there trying to dig out information from people, take over accounts, take over cards. So that is one we'll dig into a little bit. And then first party fraud is always just a continued opportunity to improve when we think about chargebacks and just kind of normal chargebacks. That's where we see sometimes a significant impact, but is sometimes the hardest to find. So we'll talk a little bit about first-party fraud as well. So going into the dark web. So what it is. So everyday internet. So the websites that we use when you're going on Google, you're shopping, you're looking at whatever it is, that's all known as the surface web. And then within that, there's the deep web, and then there's the dark web. And I'll show you kind of what that looks like. So that surface web piece, that only represents about 5% of the total internet. So I was kind of blown away by this because I think of how much of the internet is available to me just as a consumer of the internet. And that's only about 5% of that total internet content. That's the sites that you can reach, that can be accessed by the search engines. That is going to be, email, things like that. But before you can log in. So then that's all visible to anyone. You don't need any special software. You don't need passwords. You don't need any information to get into it. The deep web. So that's about 90% of total internet content. So that's the stuff that's not as easily accessible. That's where you're going to go to your banking account. That's where you're going to log into your email. That's where you might have streaming networks, gaming streaming, whatever it may be. There's some form of authentication, there's passwords, there's security firewall. That all sits in that deep web. And then you have the dark web, and that is 5% of total internet as well. That is those sites that can only be accessed with a Tor browser, if you've heard of Tor before. And surprisingly, the dark web is used not just for illegal purposes, which I think many of us think. It's also used for legal purposes. And if you look at this, the deep web is 500 times the size of the surface web. So when I say this is 90%, that's 500 times of what we're able to just access on our own. So the dark web was actually originally used by the United States Department of Defense to communicate anonymously. So it's now become, unfortunately, a hub for users to remain anonymous around the world and to use it for legal and illegal purposes. So the legal uses that we see within the dark web is in countries where government surveillance may be used to spy on and oppress political dissidents. The dark web is often a place for communication that avoids government censorship and scrutiny. While the illegal uses, that's where that anonymity, I can't even say the word, being anonymous on the dark web, that allows you to be anonymous. So you can buy and sell illegal drugs, weapons, stolen personal data. That's where you find, oh, there's been a data breach. You're going to get offered LifeLock or some sort of security thing because your information's likely out there in the dark web. That's what they mean when they say that. That's where all of that information is. And there's actually a lot of purchases being made on the dark web using cryptocurrencies. So there's been a lot of people trying to use blockchain technology like our government and the FBI using blockchain technology to start to follow these cryptocurrency purchases that are happening on the dark web to try to then catch some of these criminals that are out there using the dark web illegally. So how does this impact e-commerce fraud and fraud in general? So that stolen personal information, PII data, name, email address, credit card numbers, your login information, you get the, every year password requirements are getting stronger and needing to add additional characters, additional spaces. That's because, the easier it is, people will find those are getting put out on the dark web. And all that can be bought really cheap. You can see crypto accounts and passports from the European Union cost about $400 to $600. And all of this leads into the fraud that I'm going to talk to in the next couple of slides. So it leads to ACH fraud, card testing, account takeover, and other types of fraud, which are costing, additional fees and chargebacks and ultimate losses of donations for the nonprofit space. I also like to say with the dark web, some of the new things that I've seen pop up in the fraud space is there's a thing out in the dark web now that I've learned about called fraud as a service. So you could actually go out there to the dark web, you could find someone, you don't want to do anything, you just pay someone to do the fraud for you. You can pay someone to go out, use the technology that's available to them, and ultimately pay you and pay them a percentage, like hiring a fraud employee. Another new one that I've seen pop up, so Chat GPT, that's been great. I've used it. I think it's awesome. My husband, all of a sudden, every time I send a little sweet note, he just goes Chat GPT. And I'm like, listen, it's my thoughts, but yes, and I leveraged it. But there's actually a fraud GPT out there now on the dark web. So people are able to use that kind of generative AI to learn how to do fraud faster, better. So that's where you see that technology, that's kind of the both ends of kind of the good and the bad of what we're seeing in technology. So how does all of the information get into the dark web to start with? I think I kind of touched on it already. It is data breaches. That is the biggest one. People get in your data. That's what a lot of people are worried about. So how do we protect ourselves against those data breaches? That is kind of a big piece of understanding, fraud and the payments fraud aspect, but being able to protect yourself, which I don't go into too much detail here, but malware, phishing, ransomware, internal threats that you might have within your organization, being able to be aware of those to protect against data breaches. And you can see in 2021, data breaches actually reached an all-time high. There was over 1,800 data breaches with over 293 million victims. That was a 68% year-over-year increase, and 83% of breaches involved sensitive information, such as social security numbers, card numbers. So you can see the more data breaches, the more information that's out there, the more fraud we're going to see happening in the payment space and on our websites. And the top attack vectors, you can see here just what percentage of cyber attacks we're seeing. That phishing, smishing, and business email correspondence, I'm actually not sure what smishing is, but that's where you see potential internal threats. Those phishing emails, they look like it's from your CEO, or it looks like it's from your bank. They want you to click the link. They want you to enter your information. That's the number one way that data breaches are happening. Ransomware and malware. So this is, when they're installing things on your pages, your websites. We actually have been helping merchants recently with malware protection and remediation, because as much as some of these attacks can impact you from data sensitivity, protecting your donors, or even the payment space, when you get into malware and you get into some of those attacks as well, there's potential impacts to your business where if you don't remediate that, then you can be fined. And there's potentially thousands and thousands of dollars at risk. I've seen remediation expectations for malware attacks be upwards in the $20,000 to $30,000 to get that taken care of. So as proactive as you can be as an organization, the better. There's tons of different things out there that can help in these areas. And then just third-party supply chain vulnerabilities is 6% of attacks. So really just finding opportunities where you can these fraudsters can fit themselves into any sort of process. They will get in there. They will try to steal as much information as possible. So think FedEx, USPS, stealing mail, stuff like that. I'm going to pause quickly before I go into the bots and credit attacks, account takeover, stuff like that. See if there's any questions before I keep going.
I have one actually, and that is how you talked about ChatGPT and Fraud GPT, which I'd never even heard of. That's crazy. How is that in kind of similar AI speeding up that fraud process? Like what exactly are they? How exactly are they using it to kind of speed things up there?
So I think the biggest way that people are that I've heard, and again, it's relatively new, is that people are finding ways to write scripts to so think card testing. That's actually a great transition. So when you're trying to write scripts, you want to get bypassing certain security that merchants might have on their pages, or any sort of kind of capturing of fraud. They'll just ask. They'll just say, "Hey, how can I, get these amount of credit cards pushed through these websites? Can I or not?" And then there's a lot of people feeding information into that fraud system. So card testing is a big one. Understanding that technology, being able to get answers on how they can leverage that is probably just one example that I specifically have heard of that they've been using it for card testing. Any other questions? All right, I will get going. So bots and carding attacks. This is the one that unfortunately I've seen happen in the nonprofit space the most. It's actually for small and medium businesses, the biggest fraud threat that is happening in that space today. Not only is it quick, is it unpredictable, it's also incredibly expensive. So when you think of the credit card processing, you have processing fees, you have network fees, and once a card testing attack happens, you see this high velocity of transactions happen. At some point, there is a trigger that will say, okay, this is an attack. And then, if you don't have any protections in place, the networks will look at that. They will actually recognize the attack. They will pause they'll decline, and then they could block. And with those declines, you're paying a fee to the networks for each of those declines. And then, when they put a block, you're then shut down for credit card processing completely, and you're at risk of losing all of the revenue and gifts that are associated with that time period. So a bot attack is ultimately the use of automated web requests to manipulate, defraud, or disrupt a website, application, API, or end users. So bot attacks started out as simple spamming operations and have branched into complex multinational criminal enterprises. So they actually have their own economies and infrastructures. They're automated. They range from individual cyber criminals to vast hacking organizations. And sophisticated attackers actually write custom code to vary frequency and length of an automated attack. So it's actually designed to circumvent security monitoring. So when you think about kind of how I can start to use like a fraud GPT, it's still these more basic or kind of start off fraudsters can get a lot of information off of how these more sophisticated organizations run it. Since data breaches, often result in the large dumps of the user credentials becoming available and sold on the dark web, attackers then use automated bots for account takeover fraud, which can also be called credential stuffing attacks. So the same way that they will test credit cards, they will test credentials to log into accounts. So they rapidly test usernames and passwords in the authentication flow and consumer sites. And once they have valid user credentials are found, they'll take over the website account, lock out the legitimate users, and then they take PII, store payment methods, and those accounts to commit fraud. So you start to see kind of that same technology, that same rate of speed for bot and card testing attacks will go into place to the account takeover.
Christy, it looks like we have one question kind of in that there. And I'll just read it here as it was written. With all the fraud prevention being implemented by banks, how can nonprofits ensure that their e-commerce payments go through and don't get flagged or declined? And in particular, this is in reference to monthly donors that nonprofits might be having.
Yeah, so that's actually a great question. And some of that we'll talk about, but it really starts, the banks have their fraud prevention methods, right? So they're using similar technology to what we use at WorldPay for the merchant side of the space, which is, machine learning technology, trying to see different types of behavior across their cardholder names, cardholder numbers. They obviously have CVV and ABS, and all of that comes into play. So in order to, I think, prevent the impact by the networks for declines, it's ultimately comes down to trying to layer in those fraud preventions at the merchant level or at the kind of your organizational level. So being able to put in levels of protection on your website, within your fraud prevention, kind of in that payments flow, that ultimately allows cleaner transactions to get through the networks, and then you'll see less declines from them. So a lot of times what I see in the fraud space for merchants is someone who sees significant network declines. What happens is we will implement some merchant level fraud prevention that will allow some of those declines to shift to kind of a pre-network scenario, where instead of it sending to the network, getting declined by them, we'll decline it before it gets to them. That will usually be very similar declines to start, but there will become a point where the fraud starts to go down because we can just attack it on the front end. So it doesn't overall always stop a customer or donor being impacted by declines, but it does allow us to get a little bit more kind of targeted in why we're declining, and from an organization point of view, a little bit more insight and control over what you decline and when. The networks will still be able to decline, still safe in TC40. So if there's stolen credit cards, it's been reported for that way. They will still have that ability to decline, but we can put in some layers of protection before it gets over to them to reduce that impact and ultimately reduce some of the expense on you as an organization for the fees that you're paying for those network declines.
Can I ask a bit of a follow-up to that? Because that was a great answer. Because we know that a lot of these gateways are so good at blocking fraudulent payments by comparing addresses submitted to card addresses and common spammers, kind of knowing the trends and stuff. How much actual securities actually would you recommend is even needed on the page itself? Like, what are some of the basic kind of layers that you would have people put on there on those pages before relying on the security that you offer, that the gateways offer?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some, at the most basic, and we're definitely, this will allow us to kind of go through them a little bit more quickly at the end. Captcha and reCAPTCHA, I think that's one that a lot of people can easily put on. I will say, there's that balance, and I touch on that kind of later when we think about fraud prevention is the impact to customer experience, right? So some people aren't the biggest fan. I know I click the bicycle picture sometimes and it's like, no, you didn't get it. And I was like, where I missed something. So sometimes that's not always best, but it is useful. That is one that's starting to become less useful because fraudsters are being able to skate it. But it's helpful. Multi-factor authentication. So that is something, whether it be for recurring donors and you have accounts, having some sort of, multi-factor authentication for that. Or when it comes to making payments, having some sort of biometric face, checking their face, fingerprint, whatever, be having kind of a multi-factor authentication for payments as well. So those would be kind of two that I would say from a protecting the credit card that's going through from bot attacks that I would always recommend.
That's great. And on that note, somebody just put one other question that says, why don't some of the processors actually block bad actors by default instead of the organization needing to get a security feature turned on to do that?
Right. So there are some blocks that we will do as an organization. I will say from WorldPay's example specifically, we're very, very large. We have merchants of all sizes. We have merchants across all types of organizations. So the need is very unique as far as what people need to block or when we see fraud. We do have, there is some chargeback safe and TC40 offerings that people put out there. But there are also merchants that I see that say, don't block these, anyone. We know the customer, we want to have it. So it's a delicate balance. We do have a financial crimes team that does actually look at card testing, work closely with the networks. If they start to see types of fraud happen, And we have to look at indicators, right? So fraud has to happen first for us to then know that fraud's happening and then try to partner to put something in place. And with card testing, as an example, that's a really hard one because it's quick and fast. And by the time you catch it, the damage is done because they look like good transactions. So we do try to put in place, tokenization, trying to have, the encryption of information out there. We try to work closely with the networks to say, if you see some sort of fraud happening, let us know. Let's be proactive. We'll let the merchant know. So we do try to step in and help. But as far as being able to truly set up like a real-time authorization approve or decline system is difficult because everybody has different wants and needs. Even with the things that we do offer as a value-added service, it's so custom to each merchant because they have different kind of risk appetites. Some are willing to take on more fraud than others, for whatever reason that may be.
Yeah, there's not like a one size fits all, I guess. Is kind of
that was probably the quick, easy way to say it.
No, that's what you said would give a lot of background as to how those decisions are made, though. I think that's good to know. I want to be mindful of your time and what you want to cover. We have a few other questions on this topic. Would you like us to save those or go into them right now, you think?
Yeah, they're around kind of prevention.
Mm-hmm.
Let's save those because I'll quickly go through the next couple of slides and we'll get to the prevention piece because I do want to leave the end for that. So I think that's probably where the most is coming from. So this slide, I've talked about the account takeover, the credential stuffing, so I'll keep going. This one is just specifically talking about impacts of bots and card testing to the overall e-commerce space. So you do see 106% year-over-year increase in bot attacks. That's where I've noticed some of that happening, especially in the small and mid-market organization space. And 57% of all attacks reported on e-com websites were carried out by bots. So you'll hear it be bots, card testing, carding attacks. They're all interchangeable. Bots aren't always used. You can see 43% of the time they're not used. But that is growing. So we're seeing more and more that bots are being used to actually do the card testing attacks rather than just a human there on their own. And so I did pull some information around nonprofits specifically, as I talked about suffering more than most on card testing attacks. So nonprofit organizations have 32.7% bad bot traffic, and bots are using the donation pages to test those selling credit cards. And it's a nuisance and a financial burden that, we know nonprofits like you can't afford to endure. I unfortunately, when I was working in the nonprofit space, so quickly would see organizations be really working with me to put together kind of an event. And then months later, they were having to close down. And so, that extra unnecessary expense due to fraud, definitely is not something that we want to have to carry. And then just the sophistication levels, there are those different levels of sophistication within bad bots. And unfortunately, nonprofits are part of the kind of sector of organizations like airlines, ticketing, that are the highest proportion of sophisticated bots. And the sophisticated bots are ones that are producing mouse movements and clicks that fool even sophisticated detection methods. So they will mimic human behavior. They're the most invasive, and they tend to use that automation software or malware to connect to your sites. So a lot of times you'll hear people talk about device or behavioral data. Behavioral data is around, we can detect mouse movement, keystrokes, as we're trying to leverage all of that information from a fraud protection. And there are sophisticated bots out there that can actually mimic some of that behavior. So when it comes to fraud prevention in this space, it really is about trying to leverage multiple pieces of data together and not relying on just one thing to determine if something's good or not. Here it is, that 33%. So I'm going to move into account takeover. I did touch on this. This is just when they are taking the unauthorized ownership of online accounts. This is getting passwords, and ultimately they're really trying to steal credit cards. I mean, they want to steal credit cards from people. Some of the other impacts, they're trying to drain gift card balances. If you are an organization that has some sort of loyalty program with loyalty points, they want to steal those. And ultimately, they will create fake accounts, lock people out, transfer money from the good accounts to their digital wallets or their fake accounts. And ultimately that's where you see the biggest impact on account takeover happening. And you are starting to learn with the digital server, seeing, more and more consumers storing personal information and payment information in their retail accounts. So it's just kind of a treasure trove for fraudsters. So e-commerce apps with accounts are a perfect target for these account takeover attacks. And kind of again, the overall impact to e-commerce fraud, 33% of all e-commerce logins were account takeover attempts. 94% was the peak of malicious login attempts in 2021. And then 65% of people reuse passwords across multiple e-com sites. I'm guilty of this. I'm guilty of using the same one since like 2002 and like adding like a number here, a letter. So I am also a victim of that. And I try to get better and I try to be better, but I'm part of that 65%. So don't feel bad if you are as well. And then to move into first party fraud, friendly fraud, this is when a cardholder files a chargeback against a transaction on their account. Sometimes they knew they did it and they received the product or service. So sometimes there is friendly fraud that is truly fraudulent. But sometimes there's genuine mistakes. I didn't recognize the charge on my card. I will say some of the impacts for this first party fraud specifically happens in recurring subscriptions. So if you are an organization that, someone can put in and they're just sending you $25 a month, we see first party fraud happen in those spaces a lot more because they forgot, they wanted to stop it, they didn't stop it, or they potentially tried to stop it and they don't feel like it was stopped. So that is one of the issues that we see. Consumers also find chargebacks more convenient. So instead of dealing with the merchant trying to get their money refunded, this is them just going to the networks, they're disputing the charge on their card. And then, as a merchant or organization, you have to go in and fight those chargebacks. More than half of first party fraud cases are unintentional. They're not, really trying to be fraudulent with an organization. They genuinely don't believe it. Someone used their card, their son, their daughter, and they are disputing that charge. And then a third of friendly fraud, this is more in kind of shipped physical goods. This is item never received. So a lot of times they'll say I didn't receive the item, which we know could always be, it could involve those third party kind of shipping processors, logistics, organizations as well. So if you are an organization that ships out gifts for people for donations, and potentially you get chargebacks here for this. I will say another thing with chargebacks. A lot of you may have heard of compelling evidence 2.0. That's something that the networks have recently implemented where you can leverage additional information to help fight a chargeback. So that is something that is out there for people. And one of the things I always recommend too, if you are someone who does sees higher chargebacks and you are a subscription service, always think about your business practices. That is one of the recommendations I make to people who are impacted by this, is make sure it's really easy. So a lot of people make it really easy for someone to sign up. They make it really hard for someone to opt out. So being able to make it easy for people to stop a subscription if they want to, that is always just a recommendation to review those business practices and make sure that we're making it easy if you are a victim of first party fraud. And overall impacts on e-commerce for first party fraud, 86% of all chargebacks are likely friendly fraud, and that is actual chargebacks. So card testing attacks, bot attacks, they don't typically result in chargebacks. They are typically just these, they're stealing data, they're testing data, but it's so small. The credit cards are usually already at risk. You're not seeing the chargebacks happen for that. There is 100% increase in false item not received disputes. So that is where if you are a shipped physical good organization in any way, that is where we're seeing a lot of people charge back for item not received. And then 40% of those who commit friendly fraud will try again within 60 days. So we do see a lot of recurring chargeback. I don't want to say abuse, but sometimes abuse. And that's where, again, from my perspective, when it comes to trying to prevent friendly fraud, historical data is really important. It's something that we leverage a lot to protect against friendly fraud, and protect against all fraud, but being able to see who has a history of chargebacks within our kind of global portfolio of merchants and credit cards that are flowing through. We definitely leverage that information to help protect and increase the risk of a transaction based on someone's chargeback history. So with that, I do want to jump into the fraud prevention strategies. I think this is where some of the questions might have been coming from. So just quickly before we get into the specifics, we talked about donor trust and, fraud. We continue to see the, a slayer of consumer trust, and, having cybersecurity policies in place, making it a priority for you as a nonprofit is a really important place to increase investment. So, for those of you who maybe are in that 50% where it's important, but you haven't really been able to invest, really thinking about, how we can leverage some investment to help put some layers of protection. You guys do hold so much sensitive data, and you want to have the right systems in place to protect your donors and move the machines forward. So I'll go into in my next slide kind of how does that look like? What does that, what can we do? But I know there were some other questions that were in the chat before I kept moving forward. So Austin, I don't know if you want to throw those out.
Yeah, sure. One is you touched on a little bit how CAPTCHAs are kind of losing their effectiveness overall. They're still good layer to have, but someone has mentioned that they're kind of losing effectiveness for them, for their organization. Said multi-factor authentication is a good idea for monthly donors, but for one-time donations is the next step for them finding out what their payment processors have available in terms of security.
I would say yes. So CAPTCHA's in there. Multi-factor authentication, you can see on the slide, two-factor authentication for payments. I do say capturing AVS and CVV. So if you don't want to maybe put in what your payment processor has, I will say the more information that you're sending over to the networks. So having AVS and CVV, the networks can view checks on those. So if you're not capturing those as part of the payment, I would definitely encourage that. I mentioned the phishing emails. That's less of the payment processor side of things. What I also have seen is outside of the payment processor piece, whoever you're, if you own your own website or if you're leveraging, a kind of presenter for websites or a hosted payment page, deploying, and this is pre-network strategies, that counts for this and for payments, but having some sort of throttling on the account. So you can write some sort of strategies at the actual capture page to put some preventions in, especially for card testing, where you can say, so many cards can be entered on the page at this many times. So there are some other strategies. I would definitely say talk to, whoever hosts your payments page to see if there's any strategies that they may be able to implement as well. They can also help with malware a lot of times too. If they have something there to help prevent against some of those attacks.
Perfect. I think there's a couple others that we might want to ask, briefly at the end in the next, right at the end if we have any time. If not, we can always get back to folks separately too. So
yeah, absolutely. So this is the continuous process fraud prevention. I talked about kind of innovation strategy, being able to just evolve quickly. So I always, want to share. I think I went through these all. Is being aware of phishing, capturing that AVS and CVV, deploying pre-network strategies, whether that's within the payments flow or before the payments flow. That multi-factor and two-factor authentication for password security and for payments. And then the next piece that I want to talk about, so there is some donation form sophistication. So I specifically wanted to carve out a little bit of a space for donor information when you're capturing donor. Requiring minimum transaction amounts, that's also something that you can do when you're capturing a donation. Encrypting donor information. So again, that could be at your level, that could be something that you work with your payments page at. That CAPTCHA again, again, nothing's going to work 100% in itself in a vacuum. So being able to have a lot of layers of things is really important. Requiring additional information. So requiring email, address, things like that, that makes it much harder for a script to run. That makes it harder for people to attack you. So the more information you require, the more information that can be leveraged if you do layer in some sort of, fraud prevention after the payment, but also allows you to make it harder for fraudsters to attack. Requiring that account creation and registration. So not just having kind of where just putting in the card, sending it through, making people have to require a registration can help. And then capturing IP address as well. So if you're able to capture IP address and get that information, you can leverage that to you can leverage that actually as part of compelling evidence 2.0 as well. So it's something that can help fight chargebacks later, and data that we can leverage for fraud prevention as well. And kind of the additional ones that I like to throw out there is deploying advanced AI and machine learning. So that is, if you are going to go out there and look for a fraud prevention solution, whether that be with your payment processor like a WorldPay, or whether that be with a third party, definitely look for that AI machine learning piece. Make sure they're leveraging data. Omni-channel fraud detection is a good one. You look for someone that can look at both card present and card not present, and because to me, the more data, the better. And that's really what a lot of this comes down to, leveraging device and behavioral data. The more data we have to help protect against fraud, the better, because we can cross-check all of these data points with one another and look for those anomalies. And those are what trigger high risk. And then another one, this might be relevant to some more than others, strong anti-money laundering and KYC practices within your organization. Having people be aware of potential, financial fraud, financial crimes, potential people that are coming into your organization, maybe high-end donors. Where's that money coming from? Are you making sure that you're getting the right money and good money? And then kind of just to close it out, I think I have one more slide after this is, I always talk about kind of the only thing worse than a fraud attack is declining a large portion of good customers. So I talk about fraud. I'm out there. I'm a fraud fighter. I'm always trying to stop fraud. But I also understand that we need to make sure that we're not stopping good traffic as well, especially in the nonprofit space. You want to make sure that you are being very mindful of not stopping good donations, because you need that money and people are trying to give, and that's a good thing. So it shouldn't be at the cost of customer experience. Payment fraud is typically less than 1% of all transactions. So good customer impact should always be top of mind. And then just to kind of wrap it up, the benefits of fraud prevention, the retention of donors and increase in new donors, saving on those chargeback and network fees, as I mentioned, reducing overall operation expenses. So if you have teams of people who are, or one person who's spending a lot of time managing chargebacks or figuring out what's going on with fraud, you can kind of take some of that away. There's fully managed solutions out there, one that we offer where, kind of be a little more hands-off. Enriching the donor experience, making it easier, making it more convenient, and then having that reputation for security. You definitely don't want to be one of those companies that get named in one of those, breach attacks. It's definitely not a great feeling when you know that all of your donor information has been put at risk. So with that, that was the end of my slides. I know we have about 4 minutes left, Austin, so I'm happy to continue to take questions that are in.
Yeah, we had one internal question. We're going to get back to somebody on that's more from the Engaging Network side for someone who uses Engaging Networks. But there is one general question that is speaking to card testing. They're asking, is card testing the same as card tumbling? If not, can you speak to card tumbling?
That is actually, I have not heard of card tumbling, and it very possibly could be. And I'm going to just Google it real quick to see if it's the same thing.
And I can't with any of these. There's so many that are new all the time, I feel like.
Yeah, I know they are, and how they use it. So it looks like it's similar. I think, and it's bot attacks. So it is looking for bot testing. It looks like what a tumbling scam might do is they're actually, so they're not using actual stolen credit cards. So it's a little bit different. They are actually using scripts and algorithms to create generate possible credit card information, and push that through. So it will look the same for you as an organization, but it's how they are putting these scripts through is different. So they're randomly generating credit cards, hoping that one will work. A lot of times they'll randomly generate, they'll use card tumbling to randomly generate like expiration dates and stuff. So it's similar. And that was my quick Google look up to see. But it is similar, but it's different in how the fraudsters actually leveraging. It's not actual stolen credit cards that they're using. It's one that they're randomly generating through an algorithm or script.
Perfect. Yeah, learning a bunch here. No idea
It's never ending. I mean, it's a full-time job just keeping up.
To me, card tumbling is when I leave a credit card in my pant pocket in the laundry, but sorry. Anyways, yeah, no, I don't think there's any other questions that have come in, but I want to remind everybody that if you do have any questions, to submit them to myself. I think you have my email when you signed up. I can happy to pass them on to Christy, and or to our support team if it's something that's more engaging network specific. But we are coming up to time here, so I want to be just aware of everyone's time. I see actually we did just get one, so I'll forward that question on to Christy so she can respond to that. But otherwise, thank you everyone. Thank you, Christy, especially for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I know we're all going to be terrified and kept up tonight thinking about all these different possibilities now, but it's so, knowledge is power, and I think it really is so good to know this and know that we have a great partner in WorldPay and looking out for us in some of these ways too. So please, as I mentioned, don't hesitate to reach out to us, but the recording of this will be available, and we'll hope to see you at our next webinar. But thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you all for having me.